The dusty heat of the afternoon sun was relentless as Mac Davis stepped out of his battered pickup truck. A man of considerable size, Mac carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, his broad shoulders and barrel chest marking him as someone not to be trifled with. His Marine Corps cap sat snugly on his head, shielding his eyes from the glare as he took in the small town's quiet streets. This was supposed to be his fresh start, a place far removed from the chaos he had left behind in the city. He had just moved into town 2 days ago, settling into a modest house on the outskirts. His plan was simple: teach fitness at the community center, enjoy the peace, and let life slow down for once. But as Mac walked toward the diner at the edge of town, he couldn't ignore the subtle stares from passersby. They weren't overtly hostile, but they lingered too long, their curiosity thinly veiling judgment. The diner itself was a relic of the past, with its neon open sign flickering against the backdrop of sun-bleached walls. Inside, it smelled of fried food and coffee, a mix that should have been comforting but felt oddly tense. Max slid into a booth near the window, appreciating the quiet. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached cautiously. Her smile was polite but wary. "Coffee?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Please," Mac replied, his deep voice calm and steady. "And whatever special you've got." She nodded, retreating quickly. Mac didn't think much of it. He was used to being underestimated because of his size, his presence often misinterpreted as a threat. He adjusted the Marine Corps ring on his finger, letting his thoughts drift as he waited for his meal. The bell above the diner door jingled, breaking the calm. 3 men strolled in, their loud laughter cutting through the muted conversations. Mac glanced up briefly. The leader, a wiry man with a cocky swagger, caught his eye and smirked. The other 2 followed closely, their movements deliberate, their confidence unmistakable. The leader's voice rang out, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "What would you look at that?" he drawled, nodding toward Mac. "Big guy thinks he can take over our booth." Mac's grip tightened on his coffee cup. So much for a fresh start. The atmosphere in the diner shifted the moment Derek and his gang stepped in. Conversations that had filled the space only moments ago dwindled to whispers. Derek approached Mac's booth with exaggerated steps, his smirk growing wider with every stride. His 2 companions, Jake and Evan, trailed close behind, their grins matching Derek's. "Hey, big guy," Derek said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mac didn't look up, calmly taking another sip of his coffee. He'd learned long ago not to rise to the bait. Silence, after all, was often the best way to disarm a fool. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his tone just as grating. Too busy counting calories to say hi. The 2 men burst into laughter while Evan leaned against the booth. "Man, with all that weight, you must have been first in line when they served breakfast," Evan sneered. "Or maybe second, third, and fourth." Mac's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He picked up his fork and cut into the diner's special, a chicken fried steak with mashed potatoes, and began eating slowly, deliberately. The calmness in his movements seemed to irritate Derek. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Derek snapped, slapping his hand on the table. The sound reverberated through the room, and a hush fell over the diner. Max slowly raised his eyes, his expression neutral though his grip on the fork betrayed a flicker of tension. "I didn't realize this was your booth," he said evenly. "You want it, take it. I'm just here to eat." Derek's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Nah, I'm good standing right here. Gives me a better view of," he gestured vaguely at Mac's body, "whatever this is. Man, how do you even fit through doors?" Jake and Evan burst into laughter again, nudging each other like schoolyard bullies. The waitress, standing by the counter, glanced nervously in their direction but made no move to intervene. Max set down his fork and leaned back in his seat, his eyes meeting Derek's for the first time. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet, simmering patience. "Are you done?" he asked simply that Derek's grin turned into a sneer. "Done? Oh, not even close. I mean, come on, look at you. Big guy like you. I bet you don't even work. Just sit around all day stuffing your face, huh? Bet he's on disability or something," Jake added. "Probably milking the system." Mac's fingers curled into a fist under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. His training had taught him restraint, to pick his battles wisely. This wasn't about him. It was about the small-mindedness of men who needed to tear others down to feel tall. "Why don't you go sit down and enjoy your lunch?" Max said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Derek laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the diner. "And what's that supposed to mean? You threatening me, fat boy?" Jake and Evan stepped closer, their grins fading into something more predatory. The air in the diner felt heavier now, charged with tension. A few patrons shifted in their seats, watching the scene unfold but doing nothing to intervene. Derek leaned in, his face inches from Max. "I don't think you get it, Tubby. This is our town. You don't belong here. So why don't you finish your meal, waddle on out, and never come back?" Mac didn't flinch. His voice was steady, his words measured. "I belong wherever I decide to be, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, the diner was silent, the weight of Mac's words hanging in the air. Derek's smirk faltered again, and he took a small step back, as if surprised by the confidence radiating from the man before him. But the moment didn't last. Jake broke the silence with a derisive snort. "You hear that, Derek? Big guy's got a backbone. Let's see if it can hold up his weight." The laughter started again, louder this time, more aggressive. Mac's patience was wearing thin. He glanced at his plate, then at Derek and his crew, calculating his next move. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Derek stepped back just enough to survey the room, as if soaking in the silent approval of his audience. He turned his attention back to Mac, smirking as he tapped a finger on the table. "You're new around here, aren't you?" Derek asked, his voice dropping into a mockingly friendly tone. "See, we don't get many like you in this town." Mac kept his gaze steady. "Like me?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. That Derek's smirk widened, his eyes scanning Mac from head to toe. "Yeah, you know, big city types. Real different. You stand out. Don't take it the wrong way, though. It's just that people like you don't really, fit in around here." Jake leaned against the booth, crossing his arms with a smug grin. "He means black. Don't worry, man. We'll spell it out for you if it's too hard to follow." Evan snickered, adding, "Yeah, folks like you don't last long here. They always seem to pack up and leave real quick. Wonder why that is." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as their words hung in the air. Mac's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles whitening. He knew this wasn't about him personally. It never was. Men like Derek thrived on making others feel unwelcome, on reinforcing the idea that they had ownership over spaces that didn't belong to them. Mac let the silence linger, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You're real brave with three of you and a crowd to cheer you on," he said finally, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. "Is this what you do for fun? Drive people out because you can't handle the thought of someone different?" Derek's grin twisted into something dark. "Nah, we just like keeping our town clean, know what I mean? Can't have people like you lowering property values." Jake laughed loudly at that, slapping Derek on the back. "Derek's doing this town a service. Call him a community leader." Evan, emboldened by their laughter, jabbed a finger toward Mac. "Bet you don't even work. You probably came here looking for handouts. Let me guess, disability checks? Food stamps? Maybe a little Section 8. Mac clenched his jaw but stayed seated, refusing to rise to their bait. His calm unnerved them, even if they didn't show it. Men like Derek wanted chaos. They thrived on it. They wanted him to explode, to give them an excuse to escalate. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "You don't know a thing about me," Max said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Derek's. "But keep talking. You're telling me plenty about yourself." Derek's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained it, leaning closer again. "Oh, we know enough. Guys like you don't belong here. You think you can just show up and what? Pretend you're one of us? Nah. This is our town, our rules. And people who don't like it, well, they figure it out real quick." Jake nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we make sure of it. Ain't that right, Derek?" "Damn right," Derek said, straightening up and puffing out his chest. "See, when people like you show up, we remind them they're not welcome. Some get the hint after a few days. Others need a little more persuasion." Mac's calm demeanor cracked just enough for a flicker of anger to show in his eyes. He'd faced ignorance and prejudice before, but this was something else. These men weren't just bullies. They were a system, a coordinated effort to keep people of color out of their town through fear and intimidation. "What's the plan?" Mac asked coolly. You think you're going to intimidate me into leaving? You're wasting your time. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. Man, you don't get it, do you? This isn't a choice. We've been here a long time. You? You're just passing through. It's best you remember that. Derek stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a growl. Or maybe you need a little demonstration to make it clearer. The threat was unmistakable, and the tension in the room reached a breaking point. The other diners looked on, their faces a mix of fear and resignation. No one moved to help. No one dared to intervene. You want to make your point? Mac asked slowly, standing from his booth. His full height dwarfed Derek, his broad frame cutting an imposing figure. Go ahead and try. But I'll warn you now, you won't like the outcome. Derek's bravado flickered, but Jake and Evan stepped in to back him up, forming a wall of overconfidence. The smirks returned, their arrogance unwavering. They thought they had him outnumbered, that their strength lay in their numbers. Derek cracked his knuckles. Let's see what you've got, fat boy. Mac didn't flinch. His stance was solid, his expression calm. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Derek smirked, stepping closer. What's the matter, big guy? You scared? Or are you just too slow to do anything about it? Jake and Evan flanked him, their postures tense but cocky, like predators toying with prey. The diner's silence was deafening. No one dared to speak, the few remaining patrons frozen in their seats. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale, but Mac's voice cut through the charged air. You boys have made a mistake. You don't want this fight. Derek laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the diner's tiled walls. You hear that? Fat boy thinks he's going to teach us a lesson. He turned to Jake and Evan. Maybe we should teach him a little respect first. Jake cracked his knuckles and moved in first. Respect, huh? Let's see how much you've got. The swing came fast but uncoordinated. Mac ducked easily, sidestepping the blow and twisting his torso to deliver a calculated shove to Jake's chest. Jake staggered backward, crashing into a booth, his breath coming out in a startled wheeze. The plates on the table rattled as he grabbed for balance. You've got one chance to walk away, Mac said, straightening up, his voice calm but firm. Take it. But Derek wasn't listening. Fueled by embarrassment and rage, he lunged at Mac with surprising speed, aiming a wild punch at his face. Mac blocked it with his forearm, his other hand shooting forward to push Derek off balance. The smaller man stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair before catching himself. You're going to pay for that. Derek spat, his fists clenching. Get him, Evan. Evan hesitated, but with Derek's glare bearing down on him, he threw himself at Mac. This time, Mac caught him mid-lunge, grabbing the younger man's arm and twisting it gently but firmly. Evan yelped in pain, squirming in Mac's grip before Mac released him with a controlled shove that sent him sprawling onto the floor. Jake pushed himself off the booth, red-faced and furious. You think you're tough because you can throw us around? We'll see how tough you are when we knock you down. Jake and Derek moved in at the same time, attacking from different angles. Mac pivoted, ducking under Jake's punch and using his momentum to deliver a precise strike to Jake's ribs. Jake let out a grunt of pain, doubling over and clutching his side. Derek, meanwhile, managed to close the gap, slamming his shoulder into Mac's chest. The impact made Mac step back, but it wasn't enough to knock him down. Derek pressed the advantage, swinging again, this time with more force. Mac caught Derek's arm mid-swing, locking it in place. You're out of your depth, Mac said, his voice low and steady. With a quick twist, he forced Derek's arm down, causing the smaller man to let out a sharp cry of pain. Evan, now back on his feet, grabbed a chair and swung it at Mac. The sudden movement caught Mac off guard, and the edge of the chair grazed his arm. The pain was fleeting, but it reignited Mac's focus. He turned to Evan, his eyes narrowing. That's enough, Mac growled, his tone commanding. Evan froze, his hands still gripping the chair. For a moment, his bravado faltered, his gaze darting to Derek for reassurance. But Derek was still struggling to free himself from Mac's grip, his face contorted in anger and humiliation. Don't just stand there, Evan, Derek shouted. Hit him. Mac released Derek with a sharp shove, sending him stumbling into Jake, who had just recovered. Both men glared at Mac, their confidence cracking but not yet broken. Evan dropped the chair, taking a cautious step back, clearly unsure of his next move. The standoff resumed, the gang circling Mac like wolves regrouping for another attack. Mac stood his ground, his breathing steady, his stance unshaken. He scanned their faces, noting the hesitation creeping into their eyes. "You've already lost," Mac said, his tone calm but cutting. "You just don't know it yet." Derek's fists clenched, his face red with frustration. "This isn't over," he spat, motioning for Jake and Evan to spread out again. "You think you can come here, humiliate us, and walk away? Not in our town." Mac's expression didn't change. "You've got one more chance. Walk away now, or you'll regret it." The tension was suffocating, the diner's silence broken only by the faint clatter of a fork hitting the floor. Derek's sneer faltered for just a moment, his resolve wavering as he took in Mac's unshaken confidence. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Get him," he growled, his voice low and venomous. Mac shifted his weight slightly, bracing himself as the three men prepared to charge again. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. That Derek's grip on his pride slipped fast, his face twisted in frustration as he barked, "Get him!" His voice carrying a venomous edge, but behind it was the unmistakable tremor of fear. Jake moved in first, charging clumsily. Max sidestepped the attack with practiced ease, using Jake's momentum against him. With a quick grab and shove, Max sent him sprawling into a nearby booth, the wooden frame creaking under the impact. Before Jake could react, Mac was already turning to face Evan. Evan hesitated, his fists half raised, his movements awkward. But Derek's angry shout propelled him forward. "Don't just stand there, you idiot." Derek snapped. Evan lunged, his aim desperate and uncoordinated. Mac intercepted him mid-swing, gripping his arm firmly. With a fluid motion, Mac twisted and redirected Evan into the side of a table. Plates and glasses clattered to the floor as Evan let out a yelp. Clutching his ribs, Derek's fury boiled over. He came at Mac head-on, fists flying. Mac blocked the first strike, dodged the second, and stepped in close, grabbing Derek by his shirt collar. Mac hauled him off his feet and slammed him into the wall. The impact sent a framed picture tumbling to the floor, and Derek's bravado shattered along with it. Mac's voice was low and controlled, but the weight of his words pressed on Derek like a vice. "You done yet?" Derek squirmed, his eyes darting around the diner for help. Jake staggered to his feet, holding his side, while Evan leaned heavily against a booth, his face pale. Both men looked at Derek, their confidence thoroughly dismantled. "This isn't over," Derek spat, his voice cracking as Mac released him. He stumbled, but managed to stay upright. "We know where to find you." Jake nodded, his voice slurring as he added, "Yeah, you're done. You don't belong here." Evan muttered something unintelligible, his eyes darting between the door and Derek, clearly eager to flee. Derek glared at Mac one last time, his trembling hand pointing at him like a curse. "You'll regret this. You'll see." The gang turned and bolted for the door, their retreat clumsy and disorganized. Derek shoved the door open, and the bell jingled violently as they stumbled outside. "We'll make you pay," Derek shouted over his shoulder before disappearing down the street. Max stood in the center of the wrecked diner, his breathing steady as the adrenaline coursed through him. He surveyed the damage, overturned chairs, shattered plates, and the stunned faces of the remaining patrons. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale, but her eyes filled with cautious admiration. "Are you okay?" she asked hesitantly, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Mac replied, his deep voice calm but firm. "Call the police." "I already did," she said. "They're on their way." Moments later, the wail of sirens cut through the tension, growing louder until two patrol cars pulled up in front of the diner. The officers stepped inside, their eyes darting from the wreckage to Mac. One officer, tall and stocky with a buzz cut, approached him cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What happened here?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and professional. Mac crossed his arms over his chest, meeting the officer's gaze steadily. "I defended myself." The waitress stepped forward, her voice hurried. "It wasn't his fault. Those guys, Derek and his friends, they started it. They've been causing trouble around here for years." The officer's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Derek's name, but he didn't relax. "You're new in town, right?" he asked Mac. Mac nodded. "Just moved here." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger man who looked uncomfortable as he surveyed the scene. "Derek's known to us," the first officer said cautiously. but you seem to have made quite an impression." Mac's jaw tightened. He could hear the unspoken skepticism in the officer's tone, the subtle implication that the new guy must have done something to provoke the gang. "I didn't start this," Mac said firmly, "but I finished it." The waitress nodded vigorously. "He's telling the truth. Derek and his crew came in, started harassing him, and wouldn't stop. They've done this before, to other people." The officer sighed, running a hand over his buzzed hair. "Yeah, we've heard complaints about them. Hard to get anything to stick, though." Mac narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me they've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We do what we can, but people around here don't like to talk. Derek's family has connections." Mac's gaze didn't waver. "Connections or not, they just threatened me. You planning to do something about that?" The officer hesitated, then gestured toward the damage. "We'll file a report. If they come near you again, let us know." Mac's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He could see the reluctance in the officer's posture, the unspoken reality that Derek and his gang had been allowed to terrorize the town unchecked. As the officers began taking statements from the other patrons, Mac stepped outside. The cool air hit his face as he stood on the diner steps, his thoughts racing. Derek's threats echoed in his mind. "We know where to find you." This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mac adjusted his Marine Corps cap and squared his shoulders. If the town wasn't going to stand up to Derek, then he would. One way or another, this was going to end. That night, Mac sat in his modest living room, the Marine Corps cap resting on the coffee table. His laptop glowed in the dim light as he began his research. If Derek and his gang thought they could intimidate him into leaving, they'd underestimated the discipline of a man who'd endured far worse. He started with local news. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern. Vague reports of harassment, fights, and property damage, all attributed to Derek and his crew. Most accounts lacked names or detailed follow-ups, and the few victims who had spoken out quickly recanted their statements or moved away. The pieces began to fall into place. Derek and his gang weren't just a group of thugs. They were a system of intimidation. Their targets weren't random. They were people like Mac, outsiders, minorities, anyone who didn't fit the mold of their small-town ideal. The next morning, Mac headed to the community center where he'd just started work as a fitness coach. Between sessions, he spoke with some of the staff, careful to ease into the conversation. He learned more than he expected. One woman, a middle-aged receptionist named Sandra, was quick to warn him. "You're not the first," Sandra said, her voice low as she glanced around the room. "They've been doing this for years, threatening people, vandalizing property. They'll do whatever it takes to make sure folks like us don't get comfortable here." Mac leaned forward, his expression serious. "Why hasn't anyone done anything about it?" Sandra sighed, shaking her head. "People are scared. Derek's uncle is on the town council. His dad owns half the businesses in town. And the police." She hesitated. "They look the other way." Her words confirmed what Mac had suspected. The system in this town wasn't broken, it was rigged. Derek and his gang operated with impunity because the people in power allowed it. "Do you know anyone they've targeted recently?" Mac asked, his voice steady but edged with determination. Sandra nodded slowly. "There was a family, black couple with a teenage son. They moved here last year. Derek and his crew trashed their car, left threats on their porch. The family didn't stay long after that." Mac's jaw tightened. "Do you know how I can get in touch with them?" Sandra scribbled a name and number on a piece of paper. "They don't live here anymore, but they might talk to you. Just be careful. Derek's not going to stop. He'll try to scare you out of here." Mac gave her a firm nod. "He's welcome to try." That evening, Mac made the call. The voice on the other end was cautious at first, but when Mac explained who he was and what had happened at the diner, the man's tone shifted. He introduced himself as David Jackson and told Mac everything. "They targeted us the second we moved in," David said, his voice filled with frustration and lingering fear. "It started with stares, comments at the grocery store. Then it escalated. Slashed tires. Graffiti on our garage. The police didn't do a damn thing. Derek's uncle, he was at one of their barbecues the same weekend they trashed our car." "Why didn't you press charges?" Mac asked, though he already knew the answer. "They made it clear what would happen if we did," David replied bitterly. "We've got a kid. We couldn't take the risk." The conversation left Mac more determined than ever. Derek and his gang thrived on fear, using it to keep their victims isolated and silent. But Mac wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to run. He spent the next few days gathering more evidence, speaking to others who had been targeted, and documenting everything meticulously. Each story painted a damning picture of a town that had allowed Derek and his crew to terrorize anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. Mac also made a point to keep an eye on his surroundings. Derek and his gang weren't idle. They'd driven by his house twice that week, their loud laughter carrying through the night air. But Mac didn't flinch. If they were going to come for him, he'd be ready. As the days passed, Mac's plan began to take shape. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to dismantle Derek's operation piece by piece. And this time, the town would have no choice but to pay attention. The evening air was crisp as Mac stood in his driveway, the faint glow of the town's streetlights casting long shadows. The past few days had been a whirlwind of whispers, cautious conversations, and pieced-together stories. Derek and his gang weren't just bullies. They were predators, and the town had allowed them to thrive. Mac wasn't going to let that continue. He began his plan by focusing on the weakest link, Evan. The young man had been visibly shaken during the diner confrontation, his reluctance to escalate evident even when Derek barked orders. Evan didn't strike Mac as someone who wanted this life, just someone too scared to leave it. The opportunity came the following evening. Mac waited near the auto parts store where Evan worked, his truck parked inconspicuously nearby. When the lights inside dimmed and the lock clicked on the door, Mac approached. Evan froze when he spotted Mac stepping into the light. What do you want?" Evan stammered, his voice cracking. "To talk," Mac said calmly, stopping a few feet away. His large frame loomed, but his tone remained steady, almost reassuring. "You've got a chance to do the right thing. Walk away from this." Evan laughed nervously, his hand fumbling with his keys. "You don't know Derek. You don't know what he'll do." "I know exactly what he'll do," Mac replied, "because I've dealt with men like him before, and they always fall. The only question is, are you going down with him?" Evan's shoulders slumped slightly. He glanced around the empty lot, then back at Mac. "What do you mean? Tell me everything you know. What he's done, where he operates, who's helping him." Mac's voice was firm, but not aggressive. "You're scared of him, and I get that. But Derek's not going to protect you when this blows up in his face. You don't want to be standing next to him when it happens." Evan hesitated, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he muttered. "But you didn't hear it from me." The information Evan gave Mac opened the door to a much larger picture. Derek wasn't just targeting individuals. He and his gang had terrorized minority-owned businesses, vandalized properties, and threatened families to force them out of town. Worse, Derek's father, a wealthy local businessman, was quietly funding campaigns and keeping key figures in town on his payroll to shield his son. Mac pieced it all together, compiling every detail into a growing dossier. He spoke to more people who had been targeted, each story fueling his determination. Most were hesitant at first, glancing nervously over their shoulders as they talked, but Mac's presence, his quiet resolve, gave them courage. There was a black family who moved in 2 streets over. A neighbor whispered to him one afternoon. They only lasted a month. Derek and his friends smashed their car windows, spray-painted their garage. The police didn't do a thing. Another man at the community center shook his head bitterly as he recounted his story. "I run a small shop. Derek's crew started hanging out by my storefront, scaring off customers. I tried to file a complaint, but, well, nothing came of it." Mac documented it all. Each interview, each photo, each detail painted a damning picture of a town held hostage by fear and silence. One evening, Mac attended a town council meeting. He sat quietly in the back, blending into the crowd as the council discussed mundane issues, funding, infrastructure, and upcoming events. But when the floor opened for public comments, Mac stood. "My name is Mac Davis," he began, his deep voice carrying through the room. "I've only been here a short time, but I've seen enough to know this town has a problem." He held up a thick folder of evidence, his gaze sweeping over the council members. "For years, a group of individuals has been terrorizing residents, harassing businesses, vandalizing homes, and driving families out. And it's been allowed to continue because of silence." The room grew uncomfortably quiet. One of the council members, an older man with a stiff posture, shifted in his seat. "This isn't just about a group of bullies," Mac continued. "It's about a system that's protected them. I've spoken to people who've been targeted, people too afraid to come forward. But that fear ends now. I've sent this to the press, and I'll make sure it gets to the right authorities.